The South Florida Water Management District is paying $8.10 an hour to hunt the slithering creatures.
Florida has just made one of the most ridiculous wildlife decisions ever. For nearly 3 decades, invasive Burmese pythons have been spreading across the Everglades, and almost every control method was falling flat against these 19-foot-long monsters. And in the middle of that growing desperation, scientists came up with a plan that sounded completely absurd. They wanted to release thousands of snakes into the wild. When the idea became public, people mocked it immediately. Because on the surface, it sounded like the dumbest way imaginable to solve a snake problem. But what if those critics were missing one crucial detail? And what if this strange plan ended up succeeding where millions of dollars, advanced technology, and years of hunting had failed? To understand this, we first need to look at what was really happening inside the Everglades that pushed scientists toward such a crazy idea. Let's dive in. A paradise already breaking. Long before invasive pythons arrived, by the late 1970s and 1980s, this place was no longer fully natural. Huge engineering projects had changed everything. More than 1,400 miles of canals and levees cut through the land. On maps, it looked like progress, but in reality, it had broken the old water system that once moved slowly across the land. Instead of natural flow, water was now controlled by gates and pumps. Sometimes whole regions stayed dry for too long, and then suddenly flooded when water was released. Trillions of gallons were pushed out into the ocean, just to keep cities safe from flooding. Inside the Everglades, however, land that once stayed wet during nesting seasons was turning dry at the worst possible time. And then came another layer of pressure: chemicals. Fertilizer from sugarcane farms and nearby cities flowed into the marsh. One key element, phosphorus, slowly changed the water chemistry. At first, it looked like just more plants, but in reality, it was a takeover. Native species were getting pushed out without anyone noticing in real time. Still, from a distance, nothing looked wrong. Tourists kept coming. Wading birds still gathered in large numbers. Herons, egrets, wood storks, all of them could still be seen. And because of this, most people believed the system was fine. Even when biologists warned that nesting success had dropped by nearly 90%, but inside the system, something deeper was shifting. Alligators, which normally dig deep water holes during dry seasons, were declining in key areas. They were survival zones for fish. At the same time, the ecosystem was getting crowded in a strange way. Small animals like raccoons, opossums, and marsh rabbits were still present in large numbers. The Florida panther, once the top predator, had already disappeared from most regions. That top layer of control was gone. By 1992, everything was under strain, holding together, but barely. A system already weakened, already unstable, waiting for a trigger strong enough to break it open. And then, that trigger came in a way no one could have predicted. The escape that changed everything. In August 1992, Hurricane Andrew, a Category 5 monster with winds close to 175 miles per hour, slammed into South Florida. But this wasn't just any location. It hit Homestead, an area sitting right on the edge of the Everglades, and also a hidden center of Florida's exotic reptile trade. At the exact point of impact, something critical happened. An exotic reptile breeding facility was destroyed almost instantly. Inside, hundreds of Burmese pythons were being raised for the pet trade. When the storm tore the structure apart, cages broke open, walls collapsed, and dozens, then hundreds of snakes were thrown straight into the surrounding wetlands. Not just one place, either. Nearby backyard breeding setups, small private collections, even roadside exotic displays. All of them were hit. And when they collapsed, they didn't just lose animals, they released them. The hurricane didn't only destroy buildings, it scattered living creatures directly into an ecosystem that perfectly matched their survival needs. But what made this moment even more dangerous was not just the destruction, it was the timing. South Florida was already in total chaos. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. Power grids failed for months. Emergency teams were overwhelmed just trying to deal with human survival. Checking remote swamps for escaped reptiles wasn't even on the list. It simply disappeared under the weight of disaster response. At the same time, there was another path that led to the same result: humans themselves. During the 1980s and early 1990s, Burmese pythons were imported in large numbers through Miami, one of the world's largest entry points for exotic animals. As hatchlings, they were small, easy to handle, easy to buy, easy to ignore. But that illusion didn't last long. Within a few years, many owners realized what they actually had. A snake that was no longer small, but massive, growing fast, needing space, food, and care most people were never prepared for. And when the situation became too difficult, many didn't know what to do, so they released them into canals, into roadside edges, into the far ends of suburban highways near the Everglades, believing they were doing something harmless. A safe release. A way to avoid responsibility. And for a while, it didn't look like a problem at all. Even when large pythons were seen from time to time, authorities called them isolated cases, just a few escaped pets, nothing worth worrying about. But underneath that calm assumption, something far more dangerous was already taking shape. The unstoppable spread. By the early 2000s, huge numbers of pythons had already spread across the Florida Everglades. But surprisingly, almost nobody knew it because there were three major reasons behind it. First, they were almost impossible to see. Burmese pythons have a natural camouflage pattern that blends perfectly with the Everglades. Their scales match dead vegetation and tall sawgrass so well that they seem to disappear into the landscape. A 15-foot python could lie completely motionless in shallow water just a few feet away from an experienced wildlife biologist, and still go unnoticed. Second, they left almost no signs behind. Unlike invasive mammals such as wild hogs, pythons don't make noise. They don't travel in groups. They don't build visible nests or leave obvious trails through the swamp. Their tracks quickly disappear in mud and water, making them extremely difficult to follow. Most of the time, they lived alone, hidden deep inside canals, thick vegetation, underground spaces, and remote parts of the wetlands where very few people ever went. They were like ghosts moving through the Everglades. And third, they didn't need to move very often. This may have been their biggest advantage of all. After swallowing one large meal, a python can survive for weeks, sometimes even months, without hunting again. Instead of constantly searching for food, it can simply find a hidden canal bank, burrow, or patch of dense vegetation and remain almost completely motionless. No movement, no sound, no reason to reveal its location, which meant that even when scientists knew pythons were somewhere in the area, actually finding them was an entirely different challenge. And while they were hard to see, they were also multiplying in a way that was hard to imagine at the time. A single female could produce 50, sometimes over 100 eggs in one cycle. She would coil around them, guarding them until they hatched. That meant most of the young didn't just survive. They started life already protected inside a system that favored them. These snakes were not limited to one type of prey. Their jaws could stretch far beyond what seemed physically possible, letting them swallow animals almost as wide as their own body. Anything from small birds in the marsh, Florida wasn't just warm. It had unpredictable cold snaps in winter. When temperatures dropped, they moved into deep underground spaces. The system that was supposed to control them, instead, protected them. Something began to change in the Everglades itself. Not all at once. Something was starting to disappear. The emptying of the Everglades. We just told you that pythons were eating almost every kind of animal in the Everglades. But if that sounds like nothing more than a predator finding food, what happened next went far beyond normal hunting. Entire groups of animals began disappearing from parts of the Florida Everglades, and the numbers were shocking. In areas where Burmese pythons had become established, raccoon populations dropped by more than 99%. Opossums fell by almost 99%. Deer sightings dropped by more than 94%. Even bobcats, one of the Everglades' most capable native predators, declined by nearly 88%. Some animals didn't just decline. They disappeared completely, vanished from large parts of Everglades National Park. Animals that had once been common became almost impossible to find. If a forest burns down, everyone sees it. But this disaster was different. The trees were still standing. The water was still flowing. From a distance, everything looked normal. But underneath that appearance, the food chain was collapsing. For years, researchers had spent their nights driving through the Everglades, counting the animals they saw along roads and trails. In some areas, they barely saw anything at all. And that was the first clear indication that something was seriously wrong. The Everglades was becoming an ecological ghost town. Scientists were about to discover something even more disturbing. The pythons hadn't arrived alone. The hidden infection. When pythons entered the Everglades, they weren't alone. They also carried a parasite inside their bodies. That parasite is called Raeliatiella orientalis, commonly known as the snake lungworm. Pythons themselves were already acting as carriers. In a way, they were no longer the main victims. The parasite's microscopic eggs were released through python waste into the environment. Then insects like cockroaches fed on this contaminated material. The parasite quietly moved up the food chain, until eventually it reached native snakes. And that's where the real damage began. Inside the body, the larvae hatched and traveled through internal tissues. Breathing became harder. Infections turned into pneumonia-like conditions, but what shocked scientists even more was what they eventually found in field observations and lab studies. Parasites were surviving in advanced stages inside infected snakes. 18 different native snake species in Florida have now shown signs of infection. From southern wetlands to northern regions, the lungworm was no longer just following pythons. Because even if the entire python population was removed, this parasite would not disappear with them. Two threats at the same time. One visible, the pythons, and one invisible, a parasite spreading silently through the food web. Not all snakes were affected in the same way. Some native species showed a strange level of resistance to the parasite. No one could fully explain it. Whether it was genetics or something deeper still unknown, it remained one of the biggest mysteries in the field. But that small detail changed everything, because it gave scientists an idea, one they had never seriously considered before. A plan built around the very thing people thought was the problem. And when it was first suggested, it sounded so unusual that many people simply laughed at it. The laughable plan. But before we talk about this strange solution, Florida wasn't holding back anymore. They tried everything that money, science, and manpower could offer. First came the bounty programs. Under official state efforts like the Everglades Invasive Reptile Amphibian Monitoring Program, trained hunters were hired full-time. These weren't casual snake catchers, they were professionals. They were paid hourly. The longer the snake, the bigger the payment. It turned into a full-time hunt across the wetlands. Then came the Python Challenge, a massive public competition where thousands of people entered the Everglades with one goal: find and kill as many pythons as possible. Winners could take home prizes worth up to $10,000. They captured male pythons, implanted them with GPS trackers, and released them back into the wild. The idea was simple: follow one snake and find many more. Agencies brought in military-grade tools. Infrared drones scanned the marshlands from above. Even AI-based cameras were installed to identify snake movement through thick vegetation. All of it struggled against the same problem. For every single python captured, many more remained completely untouched, deep in the swamp. The hunting efforts only reached the edges of the population, never the core. So, despite all this money, effort, and technology, the results were largely ineffective. In the middle of that growing frustration, scientists finally proposed something that sounded almost unbelievable. Bring back a native predator into the Everglades, the eastern indigo snake, known scientifically as Drymarchon cooperi. The idea spread online within hours, and most of it wasn't serious debate. It was mockery. That one line was enough to define how the public saw it. But what was actually being proposed was something very different from how it sounded. And to understand that, we first need to look at what the eastern indigo snake really is. The eastern indigo is the longest native snake in North America, reaching up to around 8 feet. It is an obligate ophiophage. This isn't occasional behavior. It is its main way of living. Where most animals avoid snakes, the indigo does the opposite. It actively searches for them, and it follows them straight into those spaces. While many native species were collapsing under the pressure of the lungworm parasite, the eastern indigo was showing far stronger resistance than most other snakes. Instead of constriction, it relies on strong jaws. It tracks other snakes into underground shelters. It doesn't stay on the surface of the ecosystem. At first, none of this changed public perception. It still felt too simple to take seriously. Because within just a few years, the results were nothing like expected. They outperformed all earlier control efforts combined. When nature started fighting back, scientists didn't just guess what was happening anymore. Biologists discovered wild-born juvenile eastern indigo snakes. The snakes were breeding on their own. The population was no longer dependent on humans. Tracking data showed them spreading across larger regions. But then came the part that changed the entire picture. Field observations and camera traps began showing what scientists had been hoping for, especially juveniles. In some areas, they were not just feeding on them. They were reducing their numbers. It was no longer just coexistence, it was pressure on the next generation of the invasion. But the changes were not happening with indigo snakes alone. Something else was starting to shift across the entire ecosystem. American alligators, once overwhelmed by the imbalance, began actively hunting Burmese pythons, turning a former threat into a regular food source. Bobcats started showing unexpected behavior. Trail cameras captured them attacking python nests and feeding on eggs before they could hatch. Great blue herons and large raptors, like red-shouldered hawks, began targeting young pythons. Pressure was building from every direction. And what scientists realized was simple. They hadn't created a perfect solution. They had brought back something that was missing from the system. The eastern indigo wasn't a fix. It was a missing piece that allowed everything else to work again. In the end, Florida didn't just fight an invasion, it slowly rebuilt a broken system where nature started defending itself again. But the bigger question is, can an ecosystem ever fully return to what it once was? Or has too much already changed for the Everglades to ever fully go back? Let us know what you think about this in the comments below. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you don't want to miss more amazing stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. We'll see you in the next one.